What's the worst exercise for quadricep growth? In my opinion, it's the leg extension. The leg extension is essentially a shortened partial, and when you look at the evidence, shortened partials often cause up to 20% or so less growth compared to something like a lengthened partial. So what are better exercises for quadricep growth? Well, if you want a compound exercise, try the Smith machine squat. If you usually find you can't get as deep of a stretch in your quads because you can't go very low in the squat, try putting your feet a little bit further forward, and that might allow you to go deeper. As far as isolation exercises go, leg extensions, as I mentioned, not ideal. Instead, try the reverse Nordic curl. The exercise is already functionally a lengthened partial, where a lift gets harder as you lengthen the quadriceps, and you don't really get to a short muscle length at all. And so it is a lengthened partial. And in all likelihood, based on the evidence we have, around 5 studies now comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion, and 9 studies comparing lengthened partials to shortened partials, the reverse Nordic curl will cause more hypertrophy than a leg extension. So give the Smith machine squat and the reverse Nordic curl a try in your quad training.
As someone who has done their due diligence in formal schooling and is now a PhD, I would think that he would be a little bit more cautious in some of the claims that he makes. So using this take as an example, completely writing off a leg extension as an exercise just because it doesn't have the inherent quality of the stretch is poor practice. It's polarizing and definitely overlooks a lot of the benefits that we get as a result of doing the exercise. I mean, like, I don't mean to be like, look at me, but damn, look at these quads. I wouldn't have been able to build them any other way without a leg extension. And if you really think about it, there's no exercise in the gym that loads the rec fem in its short position like a leg extension does. And in comparison to the Nordic curls, like we could load the leg extensions to a greater degree. And if the stretch is the biggest variable people are looking for when qualifying an exercise as good or bad, there's a fantastic paper by Hiroku and colleagues that investigated hip flexion angles and how that influences growth in the rec fem. So a simple solution would be, hey, let's just set the seat back a little bit more and let's reduce the amount of hip flexion that you're in as you're performing the exercise. And that study has actually been replicated recently.
Let me just check you on one thing first. You can't say that your quads wouldn't be where they are without leg extension because you don't have a quad that you trained without leg extensions. So let's not create the same type of logic as the person that you're arguing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you have to look at what you actually can extrapolate from the evidence, right? Now, I'm not saying that leg extensions weren't a part of it. I'm just saying you don't have a control. You don't have a leg to stand on for that argument, if you will. My expectations of people with doctorates or coming from academia has just gotten lower and lower over the years. That's both a consequence of motivations and also the curriculum.
Yes, what
right?
It sounds like is I would like to think he knows better, but it just sounds like he's playing the social game.
I'm not going to defend and say that he knows better or not, because obviously I don't have evidence to suggest that he does, right? Especially since he has like doubled and tripled down on the stance, despite people making very good arguments and pointing out the flaws in the logic, the evidence that's being overlooked, the false comparisons, all of those things. If we just criticize the argument for the argument, if we look at a leg extension versus a squat pattern, if we're talking about like best and worst quad exercises, what you're doing is you're kind of looking at 2 different tools for 2 different jobs. They do both train the quads, but one is going to train more of the monoarticular and one's going to train the rec fem, the biarticular muscle better. They both train all the quads to a certain degree, but you're not going to have a squat pattern likely that's out going to perform a leg extension for the rec fem. And a leg extension likely, even if you do the reverse Nordic, isn't going to outperform a squat pattern for the vasty muscles. And there's a variety of anatomical and neurological reasons in terms of how we stabilize the knee joint when we have load through the foot, et cetera, and all this other stuff. So when we look at those 2 exercises and your comparison is that the leg extension is worse because the squat patterns or whatever could be better. One, that's just kind of a false equivalency because you're comparing 2 different tools, like saying, well, this hammer is better than the screwdriver. And I'm like, well, for what job? All right, are we pounding nails or are we screwing screws? And then if you do the direct comparison to the reverse Nordic, if we look at it from a first principles perspective, okay, is the reverse Nordic more lengthened? Yes, right? Is it a more lengthened challenge in terms of resistance profile? Well, that just depends on the leg extension machine that you have, but it is likely going to get you to a longer muscle length. But that's not the only variable that separates those. There are tons of conditional things in terms of stability, the total range of motion, et cetera. We don't have evidence on the reverse Nordic being good at all. So we're basically just speculating that because it is a similar joint action in terms of that it's a knee extension exercise and it's a longer length, we're going to take those two things and then forget all of the other differences about the exercises. And that, I would say, is one of the biggest mistakes people make, is they choose exercises based off of a single piece of evidence or a single principle rather than looking at like what an exercise provides in terms of value overall and how it fits in within the program. The evidence arguing for a more lengthened biased knee extension isolation exercise comes from comparing variations of the leg extension to itself, right? So what we know is the research supports doing a more lengthened biased leg extension. It does not necessarily support doing another exercise that's going to have a ton of other differences in terms of coordination, stability, total range of motion. Like, we don't know what the diminishing returns is on a lengthened partial. How small can that partial be, right? Now, Milo happens to be a person that can fold quite a bit. Like, he can get to where he's like almost laying down. Not everybody's knee joint can do that. Some people have bigger calves and hamstrings. So some people, like, their range of motion in that exercise is going to be really small. Some people, if you have short tibs, means that they're going to actually start falling over towards the back of it. So you're limited on how much you can even load the exercise, and the balance and coordination is significantly harder for a person that has different proportions. Those are limitations that don't exist in the leg extension, right? In the leg extension, the difference between sitting up at 90 degrees and then leaning back in terms of more hip extension, the difference was like what they labeled as like 170% greater rate of hypertrophy, which those numbers, you have to look at them in context, right? You're not going to get 170% more quadriceps in 8 weeks or any of the other things that like the clickbait titles will say, but that's a significant improvement, right? You look at then the studies comparing short range of motion partials versus lengthened range of motion partials for leg extension, and there's a substantial difference in a couple of those. One of the biggest outliers in terms of looking at lengthened partials is actually the McMahon study comparing short partials versus lengthened partials.
Yes.
In the leg extension. And that's important because you always have to be kind of curious of like, okay, when a study is a huge outlier, is that a legit outlier, or were there some methodological reasons of why that was an outlier? If we look at then the Pedrosa study, that compared short partials, lengthened partials, full range of motion, and then one group that split doing half of the volume short partials, half of the volume lengthened partials. Again, what we saw is that the worst group was that shortened partial, but the difference between the short partial and the lengthened partial was significantly larger than full range and the lengthened partial. And the difference between mixed partials doing half short, half lengthened was actually even less than the full range. It outperformed the full ROM group, suggesting maybe there is some benefit potentially to training both. I mean, that's not a lot of evidence, but for sure it's important context to look at. We can already see that adding length and bias to the leg extension can add a substantial benefit over just focusing on the short portion, and a small benefit in terms of partials over full ROM. So the question is, all right, how much more do we think we can get? And I think this is where, and coming from somebody that teaches people how to get every millimeter of stretch, right? It would be against my business model to say, I don't know how much more you get out of that last 1, 5, 10% of stretch, right? Like, do the majority of the gains come from just being close enough to the stretch, right? Does it double going from 80% of the stretch to 90% of the stretch to 100% of the stretch? Likely there's a point of diminishing returns where like once we're almost lengthened, like a little bit more may not be that significant, or may only be significant in certain populations. So to do the extrapolation of, okay, we have this other exercise with significant limitations, a very small range of motion, but that range of motion occurs in the lengthened position, that's a huge extrapolation. It's not at all supported in the evidence. None of the lengthened partial evidence is contextually matching that condition of going from an exercise that is very stable, very easy to load and control. There's little of a coordination demand as you can come up with, because it's like you just have to control that single joint. You're very supported. Your body weight is doing a lot of the stability for you, etc. And also it's extremely easy to set up, right? You sit. Versus another exercise that has stability, coordination, anthropomorphic limitations, right? It's a very small range of motion, right?
And you could only really load it if you do like you rig it on a lying leg extension, lying hamstring curl.
Yeah, that adds stability, but you still end up having the thing where a person's proportions will dictate how much load they can have before they actually start like falling backwards. That's just a part of it. And the other thing you have to think of is that you're also like, you're pushing off of like your shin and foot here, and now you're balancing on that. When you're in a leg extension, yes, the shin is on your pad, but you're not needing to stabilize the pad because it can't move, right? It just goes up and down, okay? And your body can't move, it's in the seat. In a reverse Nordic, your feet and tibs can roll on the floor and you're balancing your body, right? So the difference in coordination demand, the number of joints, because you're loading basically everything from your toe to your head on the anterior chain, right? Because your tibialis anterior is also, it's under a big stretch, right? And your foot is like kind of having to help you stabilize, right? You're loading your quads, but then you're also loading all of your hip flexors and your abdominals, even your neck flexors and everything. And here you're maintaining this. And that's a huge, we'll say, it's a huge coordination and stability demand, orders of magnitude greater than a leg extension.
Yes, yes. I think to your point, every single exercise we do in the gym is going to have trade-offs, right?